Hi folks, this is Karl-James Langford on channel 01 to 1975. We're looking at disease, part 4, and this is section 2 of the Black Death. So without further ado, we start with a quote of the Black Death, of the very time in 1347, probably 1348 this quote comes from Agnolo di Tura, from Siena. They died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug, and I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. So the legacy of the Black Death is not just to be seen in quotes, it's to be seen in its severity. The Black Death in Europe itself, between 1347 and 1352, ravished Europe to such a degree that by the end of it, by that very winter of 1352, 200 million people lay dead across Europe. The Black Death were the most terrible of all outbreaks of the most fearful diseases in the medieval period. The disease struck without warning. You might see leprosy coming. You might see cholera coming, typhus coming. But the 3 forms of Black Death, bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic, gave no warning. Those infected were in constant fear every day and felt themselves penetrated by pain all over their bodies when hit by the bubonic form. Then they developed the telltale buboes, the inflamed swelling of lymphatic glands, especially in the victim's groin or armpit. These swellings, like a boil in appearance, grew, I will quote, as large as a common apple, others as an egg. Bubonic form would leave the whole body with blue and black blotches. Some people vomited and spat blood. Their breath turned foul and stinking. So was the living dead of that moment. The Black Death, coming from India and China, Bacillus pesturo pestis, Yestis pestis, is believed to have reached Europe via sea, via those trading ships full of seamen. Those ships carried rats. Those rats were fleeing their own communities, where their sisters and brothers the rats would see dying, so they would escape on the ships. And on those ships the rat would die and the fleas would then jump onto their next host. By 1347, Europe was ablaze with the sweating pustules of the buboes. And then eventually by 1349, the pneumonic, the very painful form of Black Death. Bubonic plague was lighter on you. It weakened you, gave you a malaise. Pneumonic, you wish you would be dead. In England, when it arrived in June 1348, the Chronicle of Grey's Friars at Lynn records, in this year 1348 in Melcombe, in the county of Dorset, a little before the feast of St. John the Baptist, 24th of June, 2 ships, one of them from Bristol, came alongside. One of the sailors had brought with him from Gascony the seeds of the terrible pestilence, and through him the men of that town of Melcombe were the first in England to be infected. County after county, Dorset, Devon and Somerset, and then it reached Bristol. 7,000 people lived in Bristol at the start of 1348. By the end of 1348, Out of those 7,000, 700 remained, death rate of 90%. By the end of August that year, hell had opened its very gates in Bristol. The outbreak was particularly severe, and all communication with the stricken city forbidden. Spreading across land, Oxford to London, through a movement of people escaping from the plague and bringing the plague to localities of population. As we said last week, by the end of 1352, in England alone, out of the population of 7 million it had been years earlier, that very 7 million was reduced to 2. Sheep and oxen strayed at large through the fields and among the crops, and there were none to drive them off or herd them. At harvest time many crops rotted in the fields for want of men to gather them. By the winter of 1349 the bubonic plague was over, and then, feasting upon those living, 1349 brought another pneumonic plague, septicemic in 1350. But it didn't end in 1352. 1356 it would return. 1361, 1362, 1368, 1369, and so on. Every 5 years or so it would return, killing 10% of the population. Plague had become savvy. It did not wipe out the human population across Europe. It hadn't mutated to be the undoing of mankind. But if it had continued to 1353, mankind as we know it would have probably been more or less wiped out in the Western Hemisphere. Society itself would see great changes, population having been hit so dramatically. Most of the time tell us this of London, who would see in the first stages in 1348 30,000 dead of the 70,000 people living there, and then the pneumonic would do its doing in 1349. Writers of the time. But innumerable common people and a multitude of monks and other clerks known to God alone passed away. The pestilence seized especially the young and strong, commonly sparing the elderly and feeble. But the elderly and feeble would not be able to look after themselves, so they would die as well. Scarcely anyone ventured to touch the sick, and a healthy person shunned the once and still precious possessions of the dead as infectious. People perfectly well on one day were found dead on the next. Some were tormented with abscesses in various parts of their body, and from these many, by means of lancing or with long suffering, recovered. Others had black pustules scattered over the whole surface of their body, from which few, a very few, nay, scarcely a single person returned to life and health. The great pestilence, when it had hit Bristol on the 15th of August, would rage across the land, raged in England for a whole year and more, so that many villages were utterly emptied of every human being. Many ways would be seen to try to undo the plague. The flagellants coming over from Holland were those individuals who would self-scourge themselves, who would go through the streets whipping themselves with a scourge with 3 thongs and a knot, sharp points forcing them to bleed. Writing about the flagellants in the year 1349, one historian wrote, 4 of them would sing in their own tongue, all the others making response in the manner of litanies sung by Christians. 3 times in their procession, all together would fling themselves upon the ground, their hands outspread in the form of a cross, continually singing, and beginning with the last one after another, as they lay, each in turn struck the man before him, once with his flail, and so from one to another each performed the same rite to the last. Then each resumed his usual garments, and still wearing their caps and holding their flails, they returned to their lodgings, and it was said that they performed the same penance every evening. The breakdown of society, the Black Death, caused great disruption all over Europe. In Europe particularly, the most hideous excesses were practiced. Large gangs of thieves roamed the desolate countryside, robbing and murdering. They were called companies and were particularly numerous in France and Italy. Some were devoted to the service of the devil. They and many others openly worshipped the devil, claiming that God had usurped the kingdom of heaven from its rightful ruler, Lucifer. Under the stress of a breakdown in the supply of food, there were scarcely enough people to begin to even think about gathering the harvest in. Some turned to cannibalism, and that bringing with it in 1350 septicemic Black Death. Mother Nature foxed, causing the septicemic form to be very devastating. And the strange notion was preached that by giving the plague to someone else, one's own plague would pass on and disappear. Thus many ruthlessly broke into the houses of the unaffected. The great effects of this terrible disease. Before we go on to our 41 facts about the Black Death, it would have a long-lasting effect on Christianity. Christianity would break off into its new form of the Protestants in the 1400s. Whole monasteries would close down, would be most hit by the Magna Mortalitas, as the monks would write, because the monasteries became more or less completely depopulated. They were unable to fulfill their obligations and fell into disrepair. Close proximation of individuals in monasteries, any religious institution, meant that the plague would explode through the monastery and kill more or less everyone. The working population itself was revolutionized. People for the first time after the 1350s would see being paid in gold rather than kind, and were no longer to be seen as slaves on the land. What I'd like to do now is look at 41 points, 41 facts of the plague. So here we go, folks. This is what my students, I think, gleaned a lot from when I taught this. Fact 1. Plague epidemic swept through Europe, 1347-1352, killing 2/3 of its population. 2. The exact death toll is difficult to measure. Various medieval sources alter, but now we believe it's more like 200 million dead across Europe. 3. The term Black Death is recent. During the plague, it was called the Great Mortality or the Great Pestilence. 4. Although the period known as the Black Death ended in 1352, the plague would continue. 5. The Black Death was the second plague pandemic of the medieval period. Justinian's plague in the 500s was deadly and widespread, spreading across the Byzantine world. Fact 6. The Black Death followed a period of population growth in Europe, combined with 2 hugely cold years of weather and torrential rain immediately before 1347. Grain crops were short. People crowded into cities. Fact 7. In 1346, the first rumours of the plague were spreading from India and China over to Europe. Fact 8. The first named victims of the plague are to be seen on grave markers in 1338 in Russia. 10. During a siege of the Genoese city of Kaffa by the Tartars in 1347, the inhabitants were reportedly infected with the plague when the Tartars threw the bodies of plague victims into the city. Fact 11. In November 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships landed in Messina, Sicily. After trading with the cities of the Crimea Black Sea had been reached first by the plague. The ships carried dead and dying sailors, many of whom had strange back growths on their neck, in their armpits and in their groin. Many of these died within days of arriving in Sicily. 12. From Sicily, the disease took 3 years to sweep across Europe, a few more decades then to reach Iceland, and then over to Greenland by 1400. 13. In Siena, more than half the population died. Work stopped on the city's great cathedral, planned to be the biggest in the world, and was never resumed. 14. In May 1349, the plague reached Bergen, Norway, on a ship carrying wool from England. Within days of arriving in Bergen, the crew and passengers of the ship all died. Most experts agreed that the plague was caused by Erensis pestis, the bacillus carried by fleas that lived primarily on rats and other rodents that were common in the medieval period. Since the 1980s, several researchers have blamed other diseases, including anthrax and typhus, that we've already discussed and looked at. Combined with these other diseases, it would mean that your body would be so weakened, and death would undoubtedly be the result. Mother Nature itself sees that a disease should be able to be spread, doesn't have a 100% death rate. Mother Nature always sees one disease in itself, but when two diseases are combined, it foxes Mother Nature to wipe out whole populations. And when man interferes with it as well, it can be equally more deadly, such as eating human flesh, cannibalism, leading to septicemic plague. Fact 17. In November 2000, the study of tooth pulp from a French plague grave basically helped archaeologists to understand a new technique when excavating the graves of plague victims. Just remove a tooth, record what you find, and then rebury the bones straight away. Take the tooth to the laboratory, safety of the laboratory, look at the tooth. Safer way to understand the plague without any cause of infection. 18. The bacillus infects its flea by blocking its own stomach. The flea tries repeatedly to feed, but the blockage causes it to regurgitate bacillus into its host. A bit like a fly really when it's sick over its food before it feeds. When the host dies, the flea and its offspring seek a new host to warmer climes. Bacillus causes 3 varieties of plague. Bubonic plague, caused by bites from infected fleas, in which the bacteria moves to lymph nodes and quickly multiplies, forming growths or buboes. Next form, the pneumonic plague, a lung infection that causes its victims to cough up blood and spread the bacteria from person to person. Septicemic plague, blood infection that is almost fatal. 20. The mortality rate for humans who caught the bubonic plague was up to 75%. The pneumonic plague up to 95%. The septicemic plague, 100% of the people who were infected. Septicemic, unlike pneumonic and bubonic, has no cure to this day. 22. Medieval doctors believed the plague had at least one of several causes. Many believed it was punishment from God for human sins. 23. Many also believed the plague was caused by pockets of barred air, caused by earthquakes. 24. Virtually nobody suspected ever that rats and fleas were the carriers of this great plague. 25. The Jews were often accused of causing the plague to destroy Christians, even though Jews and also Muslims suffered the same as Christians. 26. After being tortured, some Jews confessed that they were poisoning wells and other water sources, creating the plague. As a result, Jews were expelled or killed by the thousands. Fact 27. As a result of forced confessions, the entire Jewish population of Strasbourg, Germany, were given a choice to convert to Christianity or to be burned in rows or stakes. on a platform in the city's ground. Many chose to be burnt. 2,000 were killed. 28. Many doctors believed that bad smells could drive out the plague. As a result, some of the treatment for the disease included dung and urine, as well as other ingredients that were more likely to spread disease than cure it. Fact 29. Other ways purported to prevent or cure the plague were to be happy, avoid bad thoughts, drink good wine, avoid eating fruit, put fragrant herbs in beverages, avoid lechery, do not abuse the poor, eat and drink in moderation, maintain a household in accordance with a person's status, and so on. Fact 30. Bathing during the plague was discouraged for 2 reasons. First, along with changing clothes, it was a sign of vanity, which invited the wrath of God and the punishment of sin. Second, bathing was believed to open the pores, making it easier for bad air to enter and exit the body, spreading disease. The latter belief was common throughout Europe well into the 1800s. Perfumes were first used during the plague to cover up odours due to not bathing or changing clothes. 33. Although the poor were hit hardest, nobility didn't escape. Whole lordships and noble families across Europe were wiped out. King Alfonso XI of Castile and Leon was the only reigning monarch to die, but many members of royal families from Naples to England were killed. 34. Bodies were piled up inside and outside city walls, where they lay until mass graves could be dug, filling many of the defensive ditches, making the defences of these cities obsolete in future generations. This contributed to the bad air and helped to spread the disease. 35. Closed communities such as monasteries and nunneries were especially vulnerable. If one person became infected, the whole community might die, and because friars and nuns tended the sick, infection among them was common. Gerardo, fact 36, brother of the famous humanist Petrarch and a monk in the monastery of Montreux, was the only survivor of the plague in his monastery along with his dog. He buried the other 34 monks, all by himself. Fact 37. Of 140 Dominican monks in Montpellier, only 7 survived. 38. English soldiers carried the disease from France to England after the Battle of Crécy, for example. Many English soldiers were left in France. 2 years later, when they returned, the devastating round of plague would be spread even further by them. Estimates claim that the population of England suffered by 75%. 39. Prior to the Black Death, music was plentiful and cheerful. During the plague, music was rare and grim. Other art forms, including visual arts and literature, also reflect the misery of the time. Fact 40. As the population dwindled and society crumbled, old rules were ignored. The Catholic Church lost influence, creating the seeds that led to Protestantism. 41. The attempts to find cures for the plague started the momentum towards development of the scientific methods and the changes in thinking that led to the Renaissance. Those are the facts. We're practically at the end of my series of disease lectures. But one thing that has to be said is that thinking about the disease and thinking about great epidemics across Europe, let's look at this quickly. In the year 429-426 BC, 100,000 people died in the plague of Athens, and is believed to be typhoid. That death rate would equal the plague if it was spread across the whole of Europe at that time. 165-180 AD, known as the Antonine Plague, wiped out 30% of the population of Europe, likely to have been smallpox. 541-542, known as the Plague of Justinian, the Byzantine Emperor, wiped out 40,000 people across Europe. and that's believed to be the very first bubonic plague. Got to say thank you for everybody listening to my videos, following us on the journey of a great Moroccan explorer, the Ibn Battuta, in 1331, that would have first seen the early signs of plague, in the journey of many that are interested in the plague. And I'm so pleased that many of you have listened to these and watched the videos for this lecture. And next week we'll be looking at the archaeology of religion. Thank you very much, everybody.